Howdy readers, I'm Jason, this is Chapter and Verse, and this is the latest in my series of Maybe Midrash videos. Maybe Midrash is a readathon in the month of May, being co-hosted by myself, Steve Donoghue, and Felicia from Little Prairie Library. I will put links in the description box below to our announcement videos to give you a kind of richer sense, I suppose, of what this readathon will entail. What I'm going to do with this video is try to explain why, at least for the purposes of this readathon, I'd like people to stay away from or steer clear of religious fiction that is published by presses like, Thomas Nelson. I'm hoping to explain why I feel like the fiction that is published by presses like that is of very, very little value in terms of how it explores religion, engages with religion, etc. The first thing that I want to do is I wanted to read to you guys a little bit from John Gardner's book on moral fiction. This was published, I want to say in the late 70s, maybe the early 80s, not long before John Gardner died. Gardner was one of the first and one might say preeminent teachers of creative writing in the United States. He was also a tremendous novelist in his own right. He was, I want to say he was the first winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for fiction. And this book kind of ruined his career, one might say. In this book, he, among other things, he sought to kind of bring down many of the towering intellectual novelists of that time and really kind of drag them through the mud. And as a result of that, he was essentially canceled. He was kind of blacklisted, you might say, by the literary establishment from that point on through the rest of his life. But what I really love in this book is what he has to say about the relationship between morality and fiction. So I am going to read a little bit here that is from Gardner's own prose, and then I'm going to read a little bit from an essay that he quotes at length by Leo Tolstoy. I believe the essay is called What is Art? But first, this is John Gardner himself. Art is as original and important as it is precisely because it does not start out with clear knowledge of what it means to say. As a general rule, the artist who begins with a doctrine to promulgate instead of a rabble multitude of ideas and emotions is beaten before he starts. And this here is from the closing argument in Tolstoy's essay, What is Art? Art should cause violence to be set aside, and it is only art that can accomplish this. The task for art to accomplish is to make that feeling of brotherhood and love of one's neighbor, now attained only by the best members of society, the customary feeling and the instinct of all men. By evoking under imaginary conditions the feeling of brotherhood and love, religious art will train men to experience those same feelings under similar circumstances in actual life. It will lay in the souls of men the rails along which the actions of those whom art thus educates will naturally pass. And then back to Gardner. Tolstoy argues, in effect, that the ideal held up in a proper work of art comes from God, was originally revealed in action by the life of Christ, the intermediary. What I take from Gardner's book, from his argument, above all, is this idea that when a writer sits down to write a novel and from the outset has a point that he or she wants to make, a message that he or she wants to convey, rather than entering into it with the idea of being surprised and exploring, then the book becomes less a work of art and more a kind of soapbox or signpost. And I find that offensive. So again, right, these novels that are published by presses like Thomas Nelson are by and large written by writers who are looking to preach, who are looking to make a point. And oftentimes that point is not even so much theological as it is a kind of weird combination of theological and political. These novels actually often feel less biblical or spiritual than they do kind of focus on the family, which again, right, they are proselytizing a certain kind of position, and they are not writing these books with an aim to discovery, right? They enter into the writing of these books feeling like they already have the answers, instead of using the book as a vehicle for kind of fumbling toward the answers. And novels that actually do that, religious novels that actually do that, are the ones that are published in the secular publishing industry, right? The literary fiction by people like Marilynne Robinson, who is a Protestant, and Flannery O'Connor, who was a Catholic, and also people like Peter Carey and Jose Saramago, who are either agnostic or atheist, Peter Matthiessen, who was a Buddhist. Those novels, right, books like The Gospel According to Jesus Christ and Wise Blood and Gilead and Oscar and Lucinda and Play in the Fields of the Lord, those novels do not set out to instruct. They set out to invite us into mystery, deeper into mystery. And that is what I feel religious fiction should do. The best religious fiction does is recognize from the beginning that it doesn't have the answers. The value of literary fiction like that, of a religious bent, comes from the extent to which it permits us to dive down into the kind of, subterranean underwater caves of our faith without light, and see what we find there, and acknowledge that that fear is okay, that doubt is okay, and that these things lead us to a clearer understanding eventually of ourselves, of God, and of our relationship to God. Another perspective on this, maybe even a final word on this, as far as I'm concerned, comes from Frederick Buechner, whose novel Brendan I'm going to be reading for maybe Midrash. And this is from a piece that he wrote. I don't know if this was a sermon or a speech or an essay, but it's collected in his book Secrets in the Dark. And this is from a piece that he wrote called Faith and Fiction. I think writers of religious fiction especially have to stay open in that way. They've got to play their hunches more and take risks more. They shouldn't try to keep too tight a rein on what they're doing. They should be willing to be less professional and literary and more eccentric, antic, disheveled, less like John Updike or Walker Percy maybe, and more like Kurt Vonnegut or Peter DeVries or G.K. Chesterton. In the stories of Flannery O'Connor, for instance, I have a sense of the author herself being caught off guard by a flash of insight here, a stab of feeling there. She's making discoveries about holy things and human things in a way that I think would never have been possible if she had known too well where she was going and how she was going to get there. And as her readers, we share in the freshness and wonder of her surprise. I suppose the brothers Karamazov would be the classic example of what I'm talking about. That great, seething bouillabaisse of a book. It is digressive and sprawling, with many too many characters in it and much too long, and yet it is a book that, just because Dostoevsky leaves room in it for whatever comes up to enter, is entered here and there by maybe no less than the Holy Spirit itself, thereby becoming, as far as I am concerned, what at its best a religious novel can be. That is to say, a novel less about the religious experience than a novel the reading of which itself is a religious experience of God, both in his subterranean presence and in his appalling absence. So that's basically it, right? I mean, that thing there that he said about Flannery O'Connor, I have a sense of the author herself being caught off guard by a flash of insight here, a stab of feeling there. When you read novels by people like Jerry B. Jenkins, for instance, or Jeanette Oke, you don't ever get that sense that the novelist himself or herself is being caught off guard by what they're discovering. Because like I said, they go into it feeling like they already know everything. And that's a problem. That's a real problem. And it's just a major handicap to the success of an exploration of religion in fiction. And yeah, so those are my thoughts on the Christian publishing industry and why its fiction is nowhere even close to being in the same ballpark as the great secular literary fiction dealing with religion. So feel free to disagree with me. I've wanted to make a video along these lines for a very long time now. But yeah, I felt like this was the best time, the most appropriate time for that. So I look forward to your comments below, and I will be back next weekend with another maybe Midrash video as we're gearing up for the month of May to arrive here in just a few days. Adios.